It's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, who comes to us from the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of America's most powerful and effective environmental groups. She is Linda Greer. Her title is Director, Health and Environment Programs at NRDC. Come on up, Linda. And she's going to offer what I think will be a very pointed and useful perspective on cleaning up the global supply chain.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon. So, I have to get this going. There we go. So in my 10-minute spotlight today, I want to sort of challenge what we've been talking about here and ask what really are the sustainable solutions we should be talking about at Brainstorm Green. And ask, is it things like renewable biofuels, sustainable transportation, bringing low-carbon fuels energy up to scale, and pitching our CFOs for sustainability solutions, which is a lot of what we've been talking about? Or is it more this? So what this is not a picture from the 1920s. This is a picture from China from just a couple of years ago. And we are actually complicit in these problems shown in these pictures because these factories are manufacturing our goods. So China now produces for the world 40% of its washing machines, 50% of its cement and textiles, 60% of its buttons, 70% of its shoes, 80% of its color televisions, 90% of its toys, and more than 95% of its compact fluorescent lights and batteries. So if much of our manufacturing is happening in China, then this, and not this, is what 21st century manufacturing is looking like around much of the world. And what I want to say today is, though we in the United States may have the luxury of thinking of sustainability solutions as making green products and expanding their market share, we're spending almost no time here discussing the problem that has been caused when large swaths of our manufacturing, making the large majority of the things that we buy, migrated to countries that are struggling mightily with the very most basics of environmental protection: air pollution control devices, water pollution control devices, and running those devices. And those photos show a massive problem beckoning sustainable solutions, which is the ruin that's being caused by the outsourcing of production abroad to countries not poised at all to control these risks. Let me take a few pictures a little more slowly to show how modern industry is really playing out in the 21st century around the world. So here's what's new this past decade in the auto industry. And what you see here is one of countless children lead poisoned in Yunnan province, which is where lead is mined and smelted for most of the world. China has become responsible for about 2/3 of the lead supply in this world, and their lead smelters have essentially no air pollution control devices for lead emissions. And what that has meant is that the children in the villages around these smelters are severely lead poisoned. The auto link to this problem, of course, is lead-acid batteries, which is the largest source of lead usage in that industry. Here's what's new in fashion. This is an uncontrolled wastewater discharge from a rayon fiber facility in Jiangxi province. Rayon production is notoriously very highly polluting industry with bad air pollution as well as bad wastewater. And with China manufacturing more than half of the world's fiber, fabric, and clothing, this opens the door to these egregious pollution problems. The latest in electronics. This is a heartbreaking photo for me of villagers who live near an electronics manufacturing facility that manufactures for a large number of global electronic brands in Jiangsu province. These mothers and grandmothers are literally on their knees begging for someone to help them address wastewater and air discharges that came from a factory making computer components. So, headline news in the future history books. In the 21st century, more than 40 years after we passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, after we engineered pollution control devices that could remove more than 99% of toxic air and water pollution, after we educated 2 generations of toxicologists, epidemiologists, engineers, lawyers, and policy wonks, After we created programs in this country in all 50 states that wrote permits, inspected factories, noted violations, and imposed fines, the architecture that delivered to the citizens of the United States the protections we all still enjoy, even here at the Ritz-Carlton, so close to the large oil refiners here, that architecture really lost its way. The factories left, gravitating to emerging economies where none of these programs are in place, and where the factories are happily belching out into air, water, and land without consequence. You know, maybe the word gravitating is the wrong word to use when I describe what happened actually, because this trend is not an accident. To the contrary, American and European companies have made a conscious and deliberate business decision to source their goods in these countries, and it's primarily for cost advantage, to save money and live better, to quote a well-known phrase. So for about the past 5 years at NRDC, I've been working on a green supply chain initiative called Clean by Design. The initiative is pushing multinational corporations to take more responsibility for factories in their supply chain in China. It has been focused largely on the apparel industry, and I've also done some work in the electronics industry. And what I've seen is that most companies know that this widespread discharge of toxic chemical pollution isn't right, and they certainly recognize the threat to their brand reputation and the risk in being associated with these highly visible pollution problems. But it's also abundantly clear to me that although there are a handful of exceptions, and a few of them are in this room, the companies are largely falling somewhere between uncommitted to addressing the pollution impacts of their manufacturing and poorly deployed and missing the target. So that's a bad continuum. The uncommitted. What they say is they don't own these places, they don't have direct business relationships with most of their supply chain, and they're not the government, so they have neither the mission nor the capacity to address these problems. I have the least sympathy for that third argument, since they were the ones to make their decision to move their production to countries that could not provide these services to them. And it's certainly not that there's nothing out there. Those engaged in CSR are publishing colorful annual reports about their efforts, and there's certainly no lack of tools. The rating tools we talked about in one of our sessions just before, things like ISO 14000, codes of contact, water calculators, all sorts of tools. However, as my next slide will show, the vast majority of what companies are working on under this flag of environmental sustainability is actually almost meaningless with regards to pollution impacts. So here's the problem. To start with, most CSR programs are about 90% about labor, and environment is a second and a distant second. Those working on environment are actually mostly working on climate change and are not working on water pollution or air pollution problems, the likes of which I showed you in those pictures. What's worse, the climate concern is really mostly to date about the footprint of their own stores and offices and the type of energy that they purchase. This is those scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions, for those of you following, and not their supply chain at all. And those actually addressing their supply chain are really only addressing their tier 1 suppliers, which is the end assembly part of their supply chain, where there often are a lot of labor issues, but there is not a big environmental footprint. That's up the supply chain with their material suppliers. Finally, those addressing the carbon footprint of their tier 1 suppliers are usually addressing this by sending self-assessment surveys to these places to benchmark the situation and asking those factories to publicly set carbon reduction goals. They are not actually requiring reductions. Where it's addressed at all, air pollution and water pollution is usually addressed with a simple contract requirement to obey the laws of the land, a provision I think we can all agree is not worth the paper it's written on in a country like China that has no enforcement of their environmental laws. So, what would a serious program look like? I've given this some thought. Serious programs, first of all, would address industrial pollution, not just carbon. Carbon is, of course, very important, but so is this. These operations are poisoning people, grossly contaminating their air and water and food. You must do both. The focus of the program should be where it matters the most, not where it's the easiest to begin. And that's at the hot spots in your supply chain, which again is usually upstream in your supply chain at your material suppliers. Compliance with environmental requirements should be mandatory, not voluntary. We are really not on a sustainability journey. We know our destination, and it needs to be eliminating these discharges. The company should undertake environmental audits. They should have programs in place to monitor compliance, and they should require corrective actions. The audits need to matter. The results really need to be important to the business of your companies and to the business of your suppliers. What this really means to me is that the sourcing team should be taking environmental performance into account with their supplier scorecards. They should be disqualifying chronic or egregious environmental polluters. If this whole program is being run out of the CSR office and has nothing to do with the sourcing department, that would be my first flag for you that we have a problem. And finally, there needs to be public disclosure and accountability of these programs, something that really allows the public to objectively track and assess progress, both here in the developed world and in the developing world. And I just wanted to put an extra emphasis on that in one of my last slides here, because, have you seen in the newspapers, the citizens in China are actually completely fed up with the pollution in their country, and they're taking to the streets to protest. It's really information disclosure to them, I think, that may be the leading edge of how we can get on top of these problems, because they are perfectly capable of providing that sort of direct pressure on polluters in their area in a way that neither foreign companies nor the government officials will do. So, my take-home message to you is this. The sustainability solutions for the 20th century are not all about green business opportunities here in the United States. They are also not all about climate change. They must also address the environmental apocalypse of toxic chemical pollution that has resulted from the 21st century trend of globalization of commerce and outsourcing production to the developing world. And my message to you is, we really need to get started. There is very little happening on the ground that addresses this problem. I'd love to hear from those working on this and create a coalition of the willing, interested in best practices out there and beginning to chart a path forward. But in the meantime, I strongly urge some brainstorming green in your executive suites and in your boardrooms. And I hope that next year when we're together at this conference, we can be talking a lot more about this problem and a little bit less about our own. Thank you, and I just wanted to acknowledge the incredible photographer in Beijing, Lu Gong, whose photographs were the inspiration for this talk and for a lot of my work. Thank you.
That was great. It was a message we really all needed to hear, and I think what we, at a minimum, need to do is get you back here with some of the leaders of that coalition of the willing to talk about the work you're doing, the work they're doing, and what needs to be done.
Very good.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.